Good evening and welcome to Writers on Writing. I'm your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and we are coming to you from the studios of Medgar Evers College over the airways of WNYE 91.5 FM. Writers on Writing comes to you each Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. I am very pleased and excited to have with me on the telephone a dynamic woman, a journalist, a novelist slash memoirist slash nonfiction writer. And I'm saying that because I think this speaks to many of the themes in her book. And I'm pleased to have Isabel Wilkerson. Welcome, Professor Wilkerson.
Oh, thank you. Great to be here.
Okay, and Isabel Wilkerson is the author of The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. Just to give you a little bit of background, Professor Wilkerson is currently teaching at Boston University. She's a professor of journalism and director of narrative nonfiction. She is the winner of the 1994 Pulitzer Prize for feature writing for her reporting as Chicago bureau chief of the New York Times. And this award made her the first black woman in the history of American journalism to win a Pulitzer Prize and the first African American to win a prize for individual reporting. She's also won a number of awards, including the Joe Polk Award for her coverage of the Midwest and the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship for her research into the Great Migration. She has lectured on narrative writing at Harvard University and served as Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. And Professor Wilkerson has spent the last year since the book has come out doing talks and readings and discussions of this phenomenal book, this book that really tells the story of the Great Migration of African Americans who came from the South. It's a story that has not been told. It's a very, very unprecedented and important part of our history. And it's the most underreported story of the 20th century. So we're going to hear Professor Wilkerson talk about this book, her process for writing it, and find out a little bit more about who she is. So why don't we begin by with you sharing with the audience what was the motivation for writing this phenomenal epic?
Well, thank you for all those lovely words about it. I wanted to write this story because I had grown up in the world surrounded by people who were from the South. I grew up in Washington, D.C., where everyone around me all of them were people who had come up primarily from North and South Carolina and from Georgia and Virginia. And they were all part of this wave of people who had come up and made a life for themselves and for their children, but no one ever talked about it beyond the fact that they'd come from these places. And then when I became a journalist and I went all over the country, I started to see these patterns and these threads. When I was in Chicago, I found that everybody who was in Chicago, the African Americans that I would meet, everyone was from Mississippi and from Arkansas or from Louisiana. And then when I was in California, I'd go out and do stories in California, and every African American that I would meet, they were from Texas or from Louisiana. And of course, when you go to New York, you find that most African Americans, many of them are from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Florida, so that there were these three migration streams. And I became aware of the fact that obviously one of my favorite books was The Grapes of Wrath, which was about this migration of people from Oklahoma and Arkansas to California, escaping the Dust Bowl migration. And that was one of the seminal works of literature for American writers. And yet there was no grapes of wrath for this Great Migration, which was so much bigger than that Dust Bowl migration. The Great Migration involved 6 million African Americans who left the South, the only place that they'd ever known, for places all over the rest of the country, places that they'd never seen before, and made lives for themselves and changed culture as we know it, changed American culture as we know it. And yet there was no grapes of wrath to tell us what was it like for them to make that decision. How did they decide to leave the only place that they'd ever known for a place that they'd never seen? How did they get the courage to do that? How did they decide where they would go? Who did they stay with when they got there? How did they literally get there to begin with? And so I wanted to understand that, and that's how I started working on this book. I ended up interviewing over 1,200 people throughout the country, and then in New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, Los Angeles, Oakland. I was all over the cities that the people had gone to, and I talked with the people, and that's how the story unfolded.
And what's very, very interesting and significant about this book is that it's really almost like a sociological study, but also a story of three individuals. So you get an intimate story of their lives. And I think that's part of what, as you and I had spoken about before, you know these people. You see these people in your parents and your aunts and uncles and grandparents. You had the intimate story of people. You described this book as really being three projects. So can you talk a little bit about that, what you mean by three projects?
Yes, well, one of them was the search for the people who would ultimately be the protagonists of this book. It's a work of nonfiction, which means that everything you read is true, but it's told in such a way that you fall under the spell of the stories of the people as if you were reading a novel. And so I needed to find these three people, and that's where I went out and interviewed people at senior centers and at their Baptist churches in Brooklyn, where everybody is from South Carolina, and there's Catholic churches in L.A. where everybody's from Louisiana, and so that was one phase of the work. Another phase of the work was then getting to hear the stories of the three people and really truly understanding what their experiences had been, and in some ways working on getting a biography for the three main people, along with, in some ways, the oral histories of the 1,200 other people that I had interviewed in order to find the three. There was sort of an audition for the three, and that was part of the oral history, and then narrowing it down to the three, and then hearing their biographies. And that took many, many years of work. And then the final phase was going through all of the archives to recreate the world that they had left and the world that they arrived to, going through newspaper articles to describe what was it like to be African American in South Carolina in 1938. What was a day like for them? What was it like to actually go out and be in the field picking cotton? And how arduous was that? And how mind-numbing was it? And how difficult was it to do that, to recreate that? And then finally pulling all of that together to create a narrative that you would want to follow from beginning to end, that you're actually in the car with one of the characters, Dr. Foster, as he's going through the desert and going through the mountains to get to California, and finding that he cannot stop for the night because it turns out that Jim Crow extends much farther than he thought it would, even going into Arizona. And you're actually on the train with another protagonist, Ida Mae Gladney, who is on the train with her two young children and her husband as they are escaping Mississippi, leaving that county. They'd never been out of the county into which they were born, and leaving for the first time, heading for a place called Milwaukee, and ultimately settling in Chicago. And you're actually on the train with George Starling, who leaves from Florida and heads to New York, fleeing for his life because he had been working as an advocate for the citrus workers who were being taken advantage of so badly. And for doing that, he ended up getting on the bad side of the grove owners, who did not like the idea of African Americans standing up for themselves in 1945, and he had to flee for his life because a lynching was in the works for him. So you're actually there with them as they're going through this. And so the three phases of it involve each step that was necessary for me to recreate it for the reader.
Right. And part of what happened, because these phases overlap, it must have been really, really challenging coming up with a way to structure this great epic. Why did you decide to use the kind of structure that you did? Because as you said, you're actually in the car with some of the protagonists, but yet you know about these events that are happening to them in the world. How did you manage or go about deciding how to present the story in this way? Because I just imagined it must have been quite a challenge to have
Uh,
all of this research and
Thank
these
you.
interviews, and then
Thank
to
you for asking. The first phase was a broad brush one where I was really just listening to the stories of the 1,200 people, just listening and hearing some similarities, some differences. Not everyone wanted to talk. I mean, one reason that the story had not truly been told was because the people didn't talk about it. Anybody who is from a family who's gone through this knows that for the most part, the people did not talk. If you tried to get them to talk, they often would begin to close up at certain points. I mean, it might tell you a little bit, but not all that you might have wanted to know. And so this was an effort to try to hear those stories. The structure was in my mind from the very beginning. In other words, I always knew that it would be three people, three protagonists, each leaving a different part of the South for a different part of the North that was according to the three routes that people took to get out, the East Coast route, the Midwest route, and the route out to the West Coast. I knew that they would have to be leaving in different decades. Each one leaves in a different decade to give you a sense of how long this migration went on. This migration began in 1915 around the time of World War I and did not end until the 1970s. So it went on for a very long time. So each one was going to be leaving during a different decade. And then they were going to be leaving for different reasons. They were going to be leaving under different circumstances, under different conveyances, and they were going to be arriving to different places where their outcomes and the unfolding of their lives would be distinct and different from the others. And together, the three of them were going to represent the experiences of most people who would have been part of this migration. Not all, but they would touch on many aspects of them. For one example, one of them is the wife of a sharecropper who has the misfortune of having been terrible at picking cotton. Now, that's a problem, because if that's your job and you're really
yes.
bad at it, then you're not, and you're stuck. That's all that you can do. Then you have a problem, and that was one of her problems. That wasn't why she left. They left because a cousin of her husband's had been beaten to within an inch of his life, and they were in some ways forced to make a decision as to whether they were going to stay there any longer. And her husband decided that they were going to go. But that was one of the examples of what one circumstance that people might have been under in order to leave. Another the protagonist, however, and it's a very different situation. He happens to be a surgeon, a very well-educated man from Louisiana who had served in the Army during the Korean conflict. But when he got out of the war, which is one of the things that was a very common challenge facing African Americans who had gone to war, here he was a veteran, and it turned out he could not practice surgery in his own hometown of Monroe, Louisiana. He'd been able to do that to some degree in the Army, but he couldn't do it at all in his own hometown in the South. And so we set out on this journey to get to California. So they were all in different circumstances, and that all together they give us a picture of what it was like in that era.
That really took. I have to really admire the fact that you were able to even think about this ahead of time, and I guess that's part of your experience and your background as a journalist and as a writer of nonfiction, is that you do think about how to structure ahead of time. Many novelists will say, "I begin to write and then I come up with the structure afterwards." One of the things is very clear that you also are talking to other writers in this text. You're talking to other journalists. Richard Wright is someone we see throughout the text. And I wanted to know if whether you can share what your thoughts were around including other writers, and maybe read something that relates to that.
Well, it was important to me that the reader could identify with the protagonist. but and their personal circumstances, and feel for them, feel what they were going through as they were driving, as one was driving through the desert and was not able, and was being turned away at every stop when he tried to find a place to stay, or the other where the mounting pressure was growing around him and he was forced to flee for his life. I wanted people to feel what they were feeling. But at the same time, I wanted people to have an awareness that it was not just these three people, that it encompassed the majority of African Americans in the North and the West are descended from people who had to have gone through what the people in this book did, just so that we could be here, just so that we could exist. And so to do that, I wanted to really bring in the facts of their experiences, some of the bizarre things that people couldn't do in the South. For example, it was against the law for a black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. I wanted to have that come alive for the reader, to know the pressure that they were under, but then also to bring in the voices of other famous people who were products of this migration, or who were people who wrote about the migration as it was unfolding, so that we could recognize how this migration in some ways informed all that an artist might have done during the 20th century. Much of the music of the 20th century grows out of the Great Migration. Much of the literature of the 20th century grows out of the Great Migration, from Ralph Ellison to James Baldwin to Toni Morrison to Richard Wright. Every single one of them was essentially writing about their experiences of being children of those who had been dislocated as a result of the migration experience that they had to have experienced. In other words, much of what we view as African American literature in the 20th century is really is migration literature. It is migration literature. And Richard Wright is one of the writers who devoted most of his work, almost everything he wrote, was truly about coming to terms with the decision that he had been forced to make to leave Mississippi and to head first to Chicago, then he went to New York, and then he ultimately left the country and went to France. And so his entire canon is essentially about the struggle that he felt between feeling alienated in his own homeland and having to search for his identity someplace else. And the book takes its title in some way. It takes its title from a passage that I discovered during one of the phases of the work where I was having to read a book a day to immerse myself in the world of the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. And I was reading the footnotes of his autobiography, which is titled Black Boy, which is about the migration, his own migration experience, ultimately going from Mississippi to Chicago. And I came across a passage which was in the footnotes of that autobiography, which was a passage that, there's an interesting story behind that, but it's a passage that was written under pressure, under deadline, because there had been an issue related to a part of the book that the publisher was not going to print, so he had to come up with something very quickly. And what he came up with, this is a part of it, and I use that as the epigraph for the book, and it reads, "I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps, just perhaps, to bloom." That's Richard Wright.
Beautiful. And one doesn't normally think about him as a poet, but this is poetry, isn't it?
It is poetry. It was written as prose, but he was a poet.
Yes. Poetry in motion. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, you have these little epigraphs at the beginning of the book. You also have another one to Richard Wright. This was beginnings in part 2. This was the culture from which I sprang. This was the terror from which I fled. That section was so moving to me, And when you think about what our ancestors, forebears went through in terms of the South, because as you said, most African Americans who are in the North, they have people who came from the South, and those three stories in Mississippi and Florida and was it Louisiana,
Louisiana, yes.
Louisiana, where they came. Just imagining what people struggled through. And one of the things that I always shared with people when I talk about this book is how this book defies the perceptions that people have about migrants and about African Americans who came to this country. It defies perceptions about marriage and a work ethic and unemployment and the motivation. And it's not, the migration from the South is not looked at in the same way as the migrations that people call immigrations from other countries. But it was that and much more in so many ways.
It was. This is the only time in American history that American citizens were forced to act like immigrants just to be recognized as the citizens to which they had been born. It's the first time in American history that American citizens had to leave or flee their land of birth, go to another part of their own country just to be recognized as citizens. No other group of people has ever had to do that in the history of our country. And in doing so, in some ways, they were acting as any immigrant might ever do, but they were doing within the borders of their own country. It's almost as if they were defecting this caste system, which had bound them up to such a degree that it was that every 4 days an African American was lynched for some perceived breach of the caste system that ruled their days. It's almost as if they were seeking political asylum within the borders of their own country. And this is what it took for the vast majority of African Americans in the North, the Midwest, and West just to exist.
Exactly.
We are the children and the grandchildren and now the great-grandchildren of people who showed incredible courage just by the simple act of leaving.
Just by leaving. And as I said, and then you bring out the fact that they were more likely to raise children in two-parent households. They were more likely to participate in the labor force. They were more likely to help turn around that whole legacy of poverty because they worked very, very hard to overcome that. And those are you help to crush out some of the myths that we have.
I think these are myths that we actually had come to believe ourselves, which
Exactly.
come to
Exactly.
conventional wisdom.
That's right.
And it's not true. And if anyone actually thinks about it, it's interesting. If you think about your own family, your own grandparents or your own parents or great aunts and uncles who might have gone north, if you think about it, I often speak to people and they often will say, well, my grandmother always worked. I always saw her working, or my father or my mother always worked. I mean, these people knew nothing but work. Where they had come from, many of them were working without even being paid. They were working for the right to live on the land that they were farming. They were sharecroppers, many of them. And so they knew nothing but work. Why would they come all this way to not work? Not only did they not become the drag on the economy that has often been described, but they often were working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And many of them, as immigrants often do, they were sending money back home to the people who were back home because that was what was expected of people once they got up north and started making money. That was expected of them, and they were happy to do so. There's many, many, many examples of that in the sociological literature, the scholarly literature that confirms that these people worked, they came to work, they worked multiple jobs, they doubled up, they tripled up. That was the way that they did things. And in fact, to the degree that a breakdown occurred, it was the opposite of what has often been said, that it turned out that the longer people had been in the North, in these forbidding, anonymous, hostile cities, actually the worse they began to fare, so that succeeding generations began to get gobbled up in the world that they had sought refuge in. Do you see what I mean? That it's actually the opposite of what has been said.
Exactly. And I found that really refreshing. That's part of what I share because, as you said, those stereotypes do persist.
Yes.
What were your most memorable moments, or can you identify any highlights in working on this over the last 15 years, I believe?
Yes, just in
15
15 years.
years.
Well, one of them had to be going back south with the two who agreed to go. Not everybody wanted to go back. One of them did not want to go back, but two of them did, and one of them was the woman, Ida Mae Brandon Gladney, who had been terrible at picking cotton, and we went back. It had been 60 years since she had been back, and seeing those cotton fields. She'd had to visit, make short trips when her mother passed away and that sort of thing, but she had not actually gone out seeing the land as I had the chance to do with her. And so we went. We were driving down this empty road in Chickasaw County, Mississippi, and it was the time when cotton is in bloom, and she saw this cotton, which she hadn't seen in so long, and she wanted to stop the car and pick. She wanted to just go out and touch it. And so I said to her, "Are you sure that we can stop here? Because, this cotton belongs to somebody, and besides that, we're in Mississippi." And she said, "Oh, they're not going to care what little bit we pick." And so she got out there, and she hated picking when she had to, but once she was out there and saw it, and it had been so long, she couldn't help herself, but she wanted to get out there and pick. And so she showed me how it was done. I remember that I'm from, my family's from the East Coast Stream, my parents had been from towns, so cotton was not anything that was in my immediate family background. So I had never even seen cotton growing, and she showed me how you do it, and then we hopped back in the car with, the few little bouquets of cotton that she had picked, and we drove on, and that was one of the experiences that stays with me. I still have that cotton to this day because it doesn't break down.
I
If you
don't
think
think
about
I've ever.
old curtains made of cotton or
Mhm.
linens, I mean, they last forever, and I still have it.
I've never seen that too, so I can imagine that was a wonderful experience and memorable. We're coming down to a close, and one of the things that you end with in your epilogue is there's an excerpt you have here from Barack Obama.
Yes.
Do you have that in front of you, or
I'm going to pull it up.
okay?
Yeah, he makes a cameo appearance
Yes.
in the book without my knowing it. I mean, in other words, no one knew at the time the significance of that moment, but he makes a little appearance in the book. He also chose the book, as you may or may not know, for his summer reading. There were 3 books that he took with him to Martha's Vineyard this past summer, and was so honored to learn that The Warmth of Other Suns was one of them. And the 2 others were novels, one by an Ethiopian writer and the other by doctor, and the other by an Israeli writer. And then he took this book along with him on Air Force One, and I'm so honored that he did that. But yes, he does make a brief cameo appearance in the book itself, and then I include him in the epilogue.
Yes. We're coming to a close. So as we do come to a close, what recommendations might you have for someone who is thinking about this kind of writing, biographical writing, or doing research, or doing an epic? Do you have any research, any words of wisdom? We have students out there who are writers. We have 1 minute left. If you can.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think that this kind of narrative nonfiction, is very powerful because it pulls the reader in, and it's so worth the effort. It takes a long time, but it's worth it. And the reason why this was done as narrative nonfiction is because people needed to know that it was true. People needed to know the truth before they could hear beyond that, however we might want to create beyond this. But you have to have a sense of passion in order to devote the kind of time that it takes to do it. And I can only say that it's so worth it. I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity and was so blessed to be able to do this.
Well, we thank you for doing this, for telling this story, for sharing with the world this forgotten history, for showing people how meaningful this part of our lives was. And I thank you for having the perseverance and the commitment to do this. And I want to encourage our listening audience to go out, if you have not already, and purchase The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. It's been on the New York Times bestsellers list. It has won the National Book Circle awards. And this is a book that you put by your table, and your nightside table or your coffee table. this is a book you can go back to. Thank you, Professor Wilkerson, for sharing your time and sharing your story with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a joy.
Okay, and this is Dr. Brenda Greene signing off. Remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. I want to thank my engineer, Fritz, for always being there. You're going to hear Going Out, Gary Bartz, I've Known Rivers.
Was inspired by a poem written by Langston Hughes. I'm sure most of you have heard of Langston Hughes.